Hello everybody and welcome back. Today we will be comparing the 223 Remington versus the 22-250 versus the 204 Ruger, and we'll try to decide once and for all which one of these three is the best overall caliber for varmint hunting and for predator hunting. We'll start by comparing these three cartridges in depth, and then we'll go out to the shooting range so that you can see which one I have selected as my personal favorite, and we'll see how that rifle and how that cartridge are performing together. As always, if you do like the video, please remember to click the like button and be sure to subscribe if you have not yet done so. I'm definitely looking forward to your comments. And also please look for the Patreon link at the bottom of the video in case you would like to support us further as we continue to do our very best to bring you increasingly better quality productions going forward. Your support is definitely appreciated. As we begin our comparison, we'll start by talking about how much or how little recoil these calibers would have and why that would even matter. You must first realize that the 22-250 is going to have the most amount of power, just raw power of these three calibers. And that means it's going to have the most amount of felt recoil also. How much felt recoil? 4.7 foot-pounds of energy would be a close approximation of how much recoil it's going to deliver to your shoulder. So what that means is that you may or may not see your target getting hit if you select the 22-250 as your personal favorite. The solution for many shooters and hunters alike is to simply shoot a 223 Remington instead, as it has about 3.2 foot-pounds of recoil, which is about 32% less recoil than the 22-250. The challenge, however, is that in shooting a 223 Remington, instead of a 22-250, you're giving up a fair amount of your speed, and therefore you're giving up some of the length of range that you can effectively hunt at. So in 2004, Hornady and Ruger jointly developed the 204 Ruger cartridge. It has all the speed of the 22-250 and even less recoil than the 223. It has 2.9 foot-pounds of recoil if you select the 40 grain bullet in the 204 Ruger, and it has about 2.6 foot-pounds of recoil if you're going to select their 32 grain bullet. What does that mean in a percentage basis? What that means is that rather than giving yourself a 38% reduction in recoil by using the 223 bullet, you could give yourself a 38% reduction in recoil by going with the 40 grain 204 Ruger, or you could give yourself a 44% reduction in felt recoil if you're going to go with that 32 grain 204 Ruger. Okay, what you're looking at here is a 204 Ruger bullet on the left. It's a 32 grain bullet on the left. You're looking at a 55 grain bullet on the right, which is a 223 Remington. You'll notice that the cartridge is just a little bit taller on that 204 Ruger, so it does have a little bit more room for gunpowder. Typically this 223 will hold between 24 to 25 grains of gunpowder, whereas the 204 Ruger, they're usually loading that between 25 and 27 grains of gunpowder. When you look at the bottom of these bullets, you'll notice it's the same basic case on the bottom. The only difference is a little bit of added length on the 204 Ruger to the case on top of that. And you may notice if you look close, the 204 Ruger is just a little bit more narrow on the diameter. Next up, we'll set the 22-250 in the mix. We'll set that right next to the 204 Ruger, and you can see kind of with the naked eye the size difference. With that 22-250, it's a taller casing. It's actually a fatter casing as well. And usually manufacturers will put about 36 grains of gunpowder in your 204 Ruger. So when we turn these sideways, you can see how much wider and how much more case capacity that 22-250 actually has. Okay, so to compare these four rounds, we've got the 204 Ruger, the 204 Ruger 40 grain and the 32 grain, the 223 Remington, and the 22-250 Remington, as you can see. Now on the 204 Ruger 32 grain, you're looking at a ballistic coefficient of 0.21. Again, ballistic coefficient is a measure of how efficient a bullet is at cutting through air, cutting through the wind without being blown around by the wind. And it's also a measure of how efficient a bullet is at retaining its starting speed. So this is going to be your poorest performing ballistic coefficient. And then in second place, tied for second, is your 55 grain bullets with your 223 and your 22-250 at 0.255 each. And your best performing ballistic coefficient of this group is going to be your 40 grain 204 Ruger, as you can see, 0.275. So as far as the starting velocities of these rounds, you'll notice your best starting speed is going to be found on that 204 Ruger at 4,225 feet per second. Coming in second place is also the 204 Ruger at 3,900 feet per second. Third place, as you can see, is your 22-250 at 3,680 feet per second. And lastly, you've got 3,240 feet per second on your 223 Remington 55 grain. Now in terms of foot-pounds at the muzzle, it's easy to see that the 22-250 Remington has the most amount of foot-pounds. In fact, it has, as far as the foot-pounds compared to your second place finisher, your 204 Ruger, you're looking at about 31.5% more foot-pounds at the muzzle than the 204 Ruger. But again, let's remember, we don't shoot animals 2 inches away from the barrel. We're just not that skilled at calling them in. So let's see what happens when these bullets travel downrange a bit. We get out to 50 yards, all of a sudden the numbers are getting a little bit tighter, but still the bullet that started off in first place with speed is still in first place with speed, which is your 204 Ruger. And let's just deal with speed for a moment and focus on foot-pounds a little later. Looking at these 204 Ruger cartridges, once you get out to about the 200-yard mark, that's the last place that's the last point in time in which the 32 grain bullet edges out the 40 grain bullet 204 Ruger in terms of speed. They're almost a dead heat at 200 yards, but watch what happens when we get out to 250 yards. Should be here in a moment. There we go. At 250 yards, you can see that that 40 grain bullet is starting to surpass, or has already started to surpass, the 32 grain bullet 204 Ruger. And when you get all the way out to 500 yards, it's still the same. You're looking at 2135 feet per second compared to 1902 feet per second out there at 500 yards. So at no time after the 200 yard mark will the 40 grain bullet 204 Ruger fail to be in first place in terms of speed with all of these bullets. It will always be in first place for speed after that. Even the 22-250 Remington will not catch it with speed at all. In fact, the 22-250 Remington, as you can see, that's almost about 6% slower in speed at the muzzle, which is not a big difference really. It's about 6% slower in muzzle velocity than the 40 grain 204 Ruger. But as we start to get downrange, once we get to about 100 yards downrange, you're looking at about a 7% difference in speed favoring the 204 Ruger. At 200 yards, this speed number of 3103 compared to 2867, you're looking at about 8.2% increase in speed over the 22-250. And when you go all the way out to 500 yards, what you'll notice is you're at 2135 feet per second compared to 1883 feet per second. You're talking about a 13.3% increase in speed over the 22-250 cartridge 55 grain bullet. But now let's go back and talk a little bit about foot-pounds. Remember that 22-250 certainly had a big edge with foot-pounds at the start. In fact, it was about 31.5% more foot-pounds than the second place bullet for foot-pounds, which was the 204 Ruger 40 grain. But as we get all the way out to 500 yards instead of being 31.5% more. It's only about 10% more. 433 foot-pounds compared to 405 foot-pounds is about 10% more foot-pounds. But again, let's remember that this 204 Ruger is coming in with more speed. The 204 Ruger started with 220 feet per second more speed than the 22-250 55 grain bullet. And as both of these two bullets travel downrange, instead of being 220 feet per second more, it gradually climbs to where it's eventually coming in at 252 feet per second more, which is about 13.3% more speed. So if you do manage to hit a coyote at 500 yards, keep in mind that this is going to be a very explosive 405 foot-pounds. They're both going to be pretty explosive, honestly. But that 405 foot-pounds, you shouldn't feel like that's not enough because it does have more speed working for it. It's going to be a very explosive 405 foot-pounds of energy hitting out there at 500 yards. Let me make a minor correction here. A minute or two ago I had told you that this figure, this starting foot-pounds number of 1653, I had told you that it was 31.5% more than 1350. I was wrong on that. It's actually 22% more, 22.4% more to be exact. And then as it travels downrange all the way out at 500 yards, I had told you that it was 10% more. I was wrong. It's about 6.9% more. So again, that 22-250 55 grain bullet starts off with about 22% more foot-pounds of energy than your 204 Ruger 40 grain. But by the time you're out at 500 yards, it's down to about roughly 7% more foot-pounds of energy. Okay, I realize at this point we haven't really done too much talking at all about the 223 Remington 55 grain bullet. But the important thing to remember that out of all of these bullets, they're all going to be pretty effective on coyotes and bobcats for sure. Probably the important thing to remember is this, that when you get all the way out there at 500 yards, whatever you would be able to comfortably do with the 204 Ruger with those foot-pounds and with the 22-250 with those foot-pounds, whatever those bullets would do at 500 yards, the 223 will do about the same job, but it's going to do it at 400 yards instead. 428 foot-pounds, right in that same neighborhood between 405 and 433. But look at the feet per second, 1873 compared to 1883 on your 22-250. So it's almost as if the 22-250 at 500 is as effective as what the 223 is at 400. So both of these rounds, the 22-250 and the 204 Ruger, they give you about an extra 100 yards of effectiveness over the 223. That's the main thing to remember from that. Okay, now so far we haven't really been comparing apples to apples when it comes to the 204 Ruger 40 grain bullet compared to the 22-250 40 grain bullet, because obviously this bullet right here on a 40 grain had a nice speed advantage at the start over your 22-250. But when we compare 40 grain bullet to 40 grain bullet, let's see how this works out. Again, you've got a ballistic coefficient at 0.275 on your 204 Ruger, ballistic coefficient of 0.20 on your 40 grain 22-250. When we get out, so your starting speed is going to be faster at 4150 compared to 3900 feet per second, more foot-pounds, 1529 compared to 1350. So it might be tempting to think that the 22-250 is really the way to go, but again, those are just muzzle velocity numbers. Let's see what happens when we get out in a little bit of distance here. At about 100 yards, those numbers are real close in velocity. Let's see what happens at about 150. At 150 yards, all of a sudden these rounds are about a dead heat. In fact, the 204 Ruger may be just a tad faster at 150 yards. Maybe not enough to really make any difference. The foot-pounds numbers You're looking at 960 foot-pounds compared to 958. So they are basically the identical performing cartridge at 150 yards. So anything before 150 yards, you will have a slight edge with your 22-250. But after 150 yards, let's see what happens. At 200 yards, you have a definite speed edge with the 204 Ruger cartridge. A definite edge in foot-pounds as well, 855 compared to 816. And what if we just go ahead and fast forward all the way out to 500 yards here? What would we wind up with? Trying to get there. There we are. We're looking at 2135 feet per second on your 204 Ruger compared to 1773 feet per second on that 22-250. Now look at the foot-pounds numbers, 405 compared to 279. So while it might be tempting to think that the 22-250 40 grain bullet is the way to go, it's only the way to go for the first 150 yards, remember that. But after that, it's really not the way to go. So, but what about the 50 grain bullet? To be honest, Hornady Superformance makes a really nice performing 50 grain bullet for that 22-250. So let's see how that Hornady Superformance will stack up. Let's bring those numbers in. So here we go. With your ballistic coefficient at 0.242 on your 50 grain bullet, you're starting off with 4,000 feet per second. So you do have a slight edge over your 204 Ruger at the start. 1775 foot-pounds. So this is where you do have a 31%, 31.5% edge in foot-pounds over your 204 Ruger. And then when we start to go out into some distance here, at what point does the 204 Ruger catch up to it, or does it catch up to it at all? At about 150 yards, it's the same thing though. 3288 feet per second on your 204 Ruger 40 grain, 3284 on the 40 grain 22-250, and 3296 feet per second on that 22-250 50 grain. So the speed at 150 is about the same on all three cartridges. Now you definitely still have an edge in foot-pounds though with your 50 grain bullet 22-250. Definitely an edge in foot-pounds, there's no denying that. When we move out to 200 yards though, you'll notice that that 40 grain 204 Ruger is still outperforming both your 40 grain 22-250 as well as your 50 grain 22-250 as well. In terms of speed, it's outperforming it, but not in terms of foot-pounds, with 1,057 foot-pounds still easily beating your 855 foot-pounds on that 204 Ruger. Let's see what happens when we go all the way out to 500 yards though. Out at 500 yards, you're looking at 446 foot-pounds on that 50 grain 22-250 compared to 405. So at that point, you do actually have about a 10% more foot-pounds on the 22-250. So that bullet started off with about 31.5% more foot-pounds. At 500 yards, 10% more foot-pounds. And as far as your speed, you still have a nice speed edge with the 204 Ruger at 2135 compared to 2,000 feet per second. So again, 405 foot-pounds on a real fast-moving bullet, you should not feel like that's just not enough. That's probably more than substantial to get the job done at those distances. Well, as you may have guessed by now, I did indeed choose the 204 Ruger as my personal favorite. Now, the rifle I chose is the CZ527 Varmint with a 25.6-inch barrel length. The first footage that you're about to see is of one of my friends shooting the rifle, first with the 32 grain bullet and then with the 40 grain bullet. Now you're going to notice that there was a lot of noise at the shooting range that day, and it may be a bit hard to distinguish when the 204 Ruger is actually being fired because it has so very little recoil. And then when it comes to the target pictures, the first target pictures that you will see are of my groups that I shot at 100 yards, first with the 32 grain bullets and followed by the 40 grain bullets in the second picture. It is important to note that I had never in my life even fired a 204 Ruger before this event, and it had been more than a year since I had even been to a public shooting range. So I'm not really the most active shooter is what I'm trying to say. And I found that that rifle and that bullet combination were remarkably easy to get used to. The CZ527 varmint had only had 23 rounds put through it. What you're looking at is bullets number 24, 25, and 26 to have exited the barrel. Those are 40 grain VMAX at 100 yards. Bullet number 27 through the rifle, just one bullet. It's a 32 grain VMAX, Hornady Superformance at 100 yards. All right, this is a 3-shot group with the 40 grain Hornady Superformance 204 Ruger at a distance of 200 yards, and the rifle is still not yet broken in. It's had less than 35 rounds through the rifle at this point. This is a 3-shot group of the 32 grain Hornady Superformance 204 Ruger at a distance of 200 yards. The rifle has had less than 35 rounds through it, so it's still not even broken in yet.